Good afternoon. Thanks very much for joining us today. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and we are here for the webinar on Inline XBRL, Understanding the Final Rule. We're very happy to have some terrific speakers with us today. We have three individuals from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have Mark Green from the Division of Corporation Finance, John Foley, the Division of Investment Management, and Mike Willis, the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. We also have Campbell Pride, President and CEO of XBRL US, and we're very happy to have the program moderated today by Brian Castrantis, who is a manager at Ritchie May & Company. Brian has been involved in XBRL for quite some time. He was formerly with PwC, and so we're very happy to have him joining us for this session. I just want to talk about a few logistical points. If you have any kind of technical issues accessing the call, please send us an email at info@xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back up and online. We are offering CPE credit for the course today, and many of you have opted to receive CPE. If you have, please make sure that you respond to the CPE questions, which will be asked at 2 points during the session today. I also wanted to point out that we do have a lot of questions to cover during the webinar. And if any of our audience have questions that we were unable to respond to during the call, please refer to SEC Release 33-10514, which contains contact information for all of our speakers, and questions can be sent into them directly, because we want to make sure that all of your questions are responded to. Okay, I'm going to move to the first slide, which is actually an SEC disclaimer, and I'm going to turn to our SEC speakers. And Mark Green, I think you may want to say a few words on this.
Michelle, thank you very much. On behalf of myself, John, and Mike, I want to give our disclaimer. The Securities and Exchange Commission, as a matter of policy, disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement by any of its employees. The views each member of its staff presents today are those of that person and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or of other members of the staff. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I also wanted to mention that we've received a few questions about the slides, and we will make the replay and the slides available after the event takes place. Okay. So with that, and those are all the questions that we've received so far. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Castrantis. Brian.
Thanks, Michelle. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to XBRL US for hosting and organizing this webinar, as well as the SEC for all of their hard work getting this rule finalized and helping us prepare for this event. We've been hearing about XBRL, Inline XBRL, and its potential benefits for quite some time now, and I think that the adoption of this rule marks a major step in simplifying, XBRL reporting requirements for operating companies and fund reporting. So thank you very much for all of your help, and thanks to everybody who's attending this webinar today. So the agenda, real briefly, we're going to talk about the rule for operating companies, what the rationale is for why this rule was adopted, and what the impact is on filers and users. Then we'll get into some CPE questions, and then cover some of the same topics for funds, what the rule is, the impact on filers and users. We'll do a couple more CPE questions, and then talk about some upcoming XBRL US events. All right, so without further ado, we'll get started on the rule for operating companies. So Mark, this first question goes to you. What is the timing of the phase-in for operating companies?
The phase-in for operating companies will occur in annual increments based on the category of filer status, and there are three of these. First, large accelerated filers that prepare their financial statements in accordance with US GAAP will be required to comply beginning with fiscal periods ending on or after June 15, 2019. Accelerated filers that prepare their financial statements in accordance with US GAAP will be required to comply beginning with fiscal periods ending on or after June 15, 2020. Finally, all other operating company filers subject to the interactive data file requirements will be required to comply beginning with fiscal periods ending on or after June 15, 2021. In a modification from the proposal and in response to comments, domestic form filers will not become subject to the inline XBRL requirements until their first Form 10Q filed for a fiscal period ending on or after the applicable compliance date, as opposed to the first filing for a fiscal period ending on or after that date. This will enable those filers to gain experience with inline XBRL through less complex filings. Two examples. A Form 10Q filer in the first phase-in group with a calendar fiscal year end will be required to begin compliance with the requirement with its Form 10Q for the period ending June 30, 2019. In contrast, a Form 10Q filer in the first phase-in group with a June 30 fiscal year end will be required to begin compliance with the requirement with its Form 10Q for the period ending September 30, 2019. And that is a summary of the phase-in.
Thank you, Mark. Next question we have for you is, are there different requirements for deadlines for US GAAP versus IFRS filers?
US GAAP filers are spread throughout the phase-in based on size, while IFRS filers are not required to use inline until the last of the three groups, regardless of size.
All right, thank you. And what is the status of the voluntary filing program for inline XBRL? Can companies continue to file inline XBRL documents using the voluntary program?
A bit of background. In 2016, the Commission issued an exemptive order under the Exchange Act that permits operating companies that comply with conditions listed in the order to file interactive data files required in their periodic and current reports using inline XBRL through March 2020, in lieu of filing all their XBRL data in a separate exhibit. Operating companies may continue to voluntarily file Exchange Act reports in inline XBRL before that time, pursuant to the exemptive order, which will cease to be operative once voluntary reporting under the amendments is permitted.
Okay. Moving on to the next question. Can companies file under the new rule in inline XBRL before the deadline?
Operating companies will be permitted to file using inline XBRL under the amendments before their compliance date once the EDGAR system has been modified to accept submissions in inline XBRL for all forms under the amendments. That is anticipated to occur in March 2019. Otherwise, filers will continue to be required to file the interactive data file entirely as an exhibit, as they do currently, unless they comply with the conditions of the exemptive order.
And could you tell us what are the differences filing under the exemptive order versus filing under the new rule?
The main differences between filing under the exemptive order and under the amendments are, first, only Exchange Act filings can be made in inline under the exemptive order, while Exchange Act and Securities Act filings can be made in inline under the amendments. And second, hardship exemptions are not available under the exemptive order.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. Next couple of questions here are going to go to Mike. So continuing with our questions on the rule for operating companies, ESMA has mandated that public companies submit inline XBRL for annual financial reports prepared under IFRS for periods starting on or after January 1st, 2020. What are the differences in the proposed program compared to ESMA?
Well, some of the differences there, Brian, and we have been talking with the ESMA staff, our counterparts over there. And I guess up until a few months ago, there was the whole inline versus XBRL difference, but now that's been handled through the rule. But the primary differences are, number one, SEC specific reporting requirements, which of course aren't going to occur in European markets. They're included in the SEC reporting taxonomies. So the IFRS filers should note, do not use the US GAAP taxonomy going forward. Use the IFRS taxonomy and the SEC reporting taxonomy. That approach is very consistent with what the guidance is provided by the ISB in terms of the implementation for their taxonomy. And frankly, it's just the best practice on how to use a base taxonomy with a supplemental jurisdictional taxonomy rather than creating a whole new idea every time the standards change. So one is the SEC reporting taxonomy is for SEC specific reporting requirements. Number two, ESMA has announced they're going to use anchoring for any extensions. That's something that's not currently required by the Commission. That idea can be addressed at the filer agent or software level. It's not an SEC requirement. While it's required by ESMA, the reports can simply be included in SEC EDGAR filings if the filers would like to do that when they get ready to do that. Third difference is in the architecture of the IFRS and US GAAP taxonomy for extensions, specifically with the application of segment and scenario containers. The plan there is to migrate the IFRS architecture towards a more common approach, have the IFRS guidance in the filer manual be published and updated by ESMA to document those options as part of the discussions with the ISB. Then the fourth difference that's significant is the assurance plans that ESMA has. And I think that's probably the subject of the next question, so I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you, Mike. And has the staff considered how this might impact the reporting burden for foreign private issuers?
Well, yeah, we have. That's why we've been talking to the ESMA staff, and the differences I just highlighted in substance would have de minimis, if any, burden on the filers, because those differences can either be handled by the software or just accepted into all systems, like in the example of the anchoring. Just if you want to file it in EDGAR, you'll be able to do that. If you don't, your software should be able to strip it out and not include it. It's kind of going to be up to the filers for that purpose.
All right, excellent. And the burning question that I think has been on a lot of people's mind related to assurance. So has there been any consideration of an audit requirement for inline XBRL data versus traditional XBRL data? This one goes to you, Mark.
To answer this, I want to do a little bit of history. When the Commission adopted the traditional or current XBRL data requirements for financial statement information in 2009, it stated its position that first, auditors are not required to perform any audit or review procedures with reference to the interactive data files, and second, filers are not required to obtain assurance on their interactive data files or involve third parties, such as auditors or consultants, in the creation of their interactive data files. Fast forward, the amendments imposing inline XBRL requirements for financial statement information relate only to the manner of submitting the interactive data file and not the data that comprise the file. Consistent with the amendments only requiring a change in format, the Commission reiterated this 2009 position in connection with the amendments.
Thank you, Mark. And the question that came in from the internet here, just want to back up a little bit. This goes to you, Mike. Can you explain what inline XBRL is for those who aren't aware of what inline is in comparison to traditional XBRL?
Sure. So the current program where you have an HTML document separately filed from the XBRL exhibits, those are two separate filings. One's the XBRL structured filing, the other one is an HTML human readable. So you have two different filings. One is largely human readable, the HTML, the XBRL is machine readable. Inline XBRL basically converges those two into a single filing that's both human readable and machine readable as one idea. And I think in a few minutes I can give some examples of what that enables from a features and capabilities perspective. But simply put, inline XBRL is simply a file format that combines both human readable HTML and the machine readable XBRL into a single idea.
Thank you, Mike. And now turning back to Mark, will companies have to report their earnings releases using inline XBRL?
inline XBRL requirements will require operating company financial statement interactive data to be embedded into the filing rather than appear in an exhibit. The legal framework for operating company interactive data otherwise stays the same. So as a result, because earnings releases are not currently required to be tagged in traditional XBRL, neither would they be required to be tagged in inline XBRL.
Thank you for clarifying that. Next, we're going to move on to some discussion around the rationale for this rule. So Mike, if you could tell us, what does the SEC see as the primary benefits of the move to inline XBRL for operating companies?
Sure. I think at the core of this is the idea of reducing burden while at the same time making the information more transparent. Let me be a little bit more specific. So I just mentioned there's currently two filings, the HTML and the XBRL. So moving to inline will remove that duplication and any of the risk and time associated with trying to manage those different filings. So a single filing that will have the implications of hopefully lowering filer cost by going to the single filing, but also through the features and filters that are available in the open source inline XBRL viewer. We hope that filers and frankly investors will use those tools to more effectively assess the quality, comparisons, numeric, do benchmarking, and other types of features that are part of their report assembly and analytical process. We think that will be very useful to them. Another item is basically giving the preparer full control over the presentation of XBRL disclosures within the HTML filing. In the past, there was probably some inappropriate, inordinate amount of time that might have been spent on the machine readable to have it rendered in the correct way. In an inline document, the rendering is actually done by the HTML layer. And so filers can focus on that and not spend any time worrying about the rendering of the machine readable because it's no longer relevant. So that'll reduce the incentive to spend any time on that unnecessary presentation related tagging activity. Another feature there is we're going to eliminate the website posting requirements. Hopefully that'll reduce compliance burden. I realize it's not a lot, but we'll reduce that requirement. And I think for the funds, and John may talk about this more later, the amendments will also facilitate efficiencies in the filing process by permitting the concurrent submission of the XBRL data files with certain post-effective amendment filings.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Next question here, and I think this is probably to address some of the comments that came back on the original rule. If mapping the taxonomy to the individual entity's financial statements is 80% of the effort, and the same process is followed for instance creation, how is it justified to say that inline will be more cost-effective for preparers?
Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the mapping of the taxonomy to the filer financial statements. I personally think that's well over 80% of the effort, but if you want to presume for sake of discussion today that it's 80%, that's fine with me. I think we can also look at during the voluntary filing program, we did not observe that any vendors increase their fees or prices related to their adoption of the inline XBRL publishing capabilities for the companies that participated in that voluntary program. So to actually get to how does this reduce cost? Well, if we look at many of the report review and assembly processes there, they tend to be highly manual with some automation now coming on play by some of the vendors. We think that the XBRL, the inline XBRL viewer and its capabilities begin to enable filers to more quickly assess their filings, whether it's to assess all the common disclosures, all the required disclosures, to look at benchmarking, to do red line changing on narratives, to assess reference link to their authoritative content, maybe to their permanent file memos, to their risk models, all those kinds of things, pull up negative values, pull up all the extensions, all that can now be available through a mouse click, right on the face of the report. So just think about it as a filer, if you're trying to figure out the risk associated with a particular disclosure and trying to benchmark that against other filings, that is something that the inline viewer can enable with a mouse click directly on top of the draft report. So we think that that kind of capability and feature provides a lot of cost savings and time savings, and maybe some incremental risk assessments to the filer as well as the analyst community. So I think more broadly, and kind of much the same way that HTML and frankly any other supply chain standardization over history works to enhance processes and lower costs, Inline XBRL is sort of in that same boat. And the application of the Inline XBRL, is, as Mark mentioned earlier, it's really just a file format. Okay, so if you prepare a 300-page Word document and you save it as a Word document, and then you turn around and save it as a PDF document, that's sort of the incremental cost of creating the incremental format document. Inline XBRL should be that same kind of incremental cost. File save as HTML, file save as Inline XBRL. You're done. So we don't really see that file save as activity as having a significant burden on really anybody. And the cost savings come from all the enhanced processes that are enabled by that combined machine readable and human readable format and the features that the software can now bring to bear directly on the draft report.
Thanks. That was a great analogy. Next question, does the SEC perceive risk to data quality associated with Inline XBRL, given that preparers will be more apt to tag the presentation rather than the underlying substance of the reported assertions?
Yeah, not at all. I think it's the other way around. I think we saw a lot of companies spending time, as I mentioned just a minute ago, inappropriately trying to structure the report so they could get a rendering outcome. Now they can just focus on the presentation via the inline, structure the data in the background. Now, I will also emphasize again with the Inline XBRL viewer filters, filers and investors should be able to more readily identify data quality issues and thereby more efficiently identify and correct them than they may have done so in the past. With the increasing use of this open source rules that are available from the XBRL US Data Quality Committee, we should also see the data quality continue to improve. So I guess a plug for XBRL US Data Quality Committee. If filers aren't aware of those rules, please go take a look at them. And I'll talk about those maybe in a few more minutes, but that's a good thing also to see as a way to reduce some of the data quality issues. Then finally, Brian, with Inline XBRL and the viewer, we think that's going to facilitate the review of the XBRL data so that filers can more easily identify any inconsistencies. Now, that said, Inline XBRL cannot ensure the accuracy of the underlying data. However, we do expect the data errors will be more visible to the reporting professionals. For instance, if they use that Inline XBRL viewer and some of the filters that are now available to identify all of the common errors that we see, those will just be a mouse click away.
Excellent. All right, so now moving on to discuss some of the impact on filers and users. This question goes to Campbell. Campbell, what additional tools or training should companies consider in order to be able to comply with the Inline XBRL requirements? Are vendors ready to support it? And will this have an impact on users of data?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So probably the first question to ask, I'll ask the second one first. So we have done a survey of our members who represent the majority of the XBRL filing preparing community. And they've indicated to us that basically by the enactment of the rule, they will all be ready to support inline filings. And as you're probably aware, a number of companies are already filing an inline XBRL, so a number of vendors are already supporting the standard, so that's already going ahead. So from what we've seen, everyone's indicated that they already can complete inline XBRL filings, or they will be able to. So, but if you want more information on that, if you have a service provider or using software that helps you do that, you probably want to talk to them and then see what the earliest date is that you could file. But no one seems to have any concerns about meeting the timeline. So in terms of the additional tools or training should companies consider, obviously most people, if you're using software, the ones that have indicated to us is that you probably won't need any of the tools. In fact, it may be in some software it's going to be no difference whatsoever. And then depending on the solution you have, there may be additional things you want to do. But that's really going to be on a case-by-case basis and depending on the approach that you use. If you're preparing the filings yourself using software, there may be impact depending on the software, there may not be impact. So you really need to talk to your software vendors about that. In terms of users of the data, so we've talked to a number of folks and companies who are using the data. Today, Inline XBRL can be just turned into a regular XBRL document. So most people who are using the data can turn it into XBRL automatically. So that's not really representing a challenge to them. And I know in our case, we use the data and we've been taking that data, the inline filings to date, and we've really had no change in our process because of that. So I think from a data perspective user, there will be no additional work that needs to be required. However, Inline does give you a lot of opportunities to use the data in new ways, particularly now that the XBRL data and the actual filing itself are the same. It means you can start to overlay a lot more information on it. So as Mike mentioned earlier, one of the things that folks are starting to do is to do comparison analysis on the filing. So you can look at the data in a filing and then you can see comparison to peers or time series analysis or see data quality problems in the filing. So those two things are tied closely together. It gives you a lot of opportunities to do a lot more with the information. Some people who are using the data, I know are going to be doing some updates to their software as well to be able to get additional information in the databases that they have. Inline does give you more information. It gives you what you didn't have with the XBRL in the past was what was the number actually reported as. So now you can kind of see that, and that's kind of more like the formatting information. You can see it was reported as, 4 million may have been just reported as 4 with 1 million text after it. And that can be useful if you want to go back and trace data back to the actual filing. So that's all useful.
So that sounds like good news between your response there and Mike's earlier comments. It sounds like for most filers, there won't be a lot of new tools or technology that they need to implement.
That's right.
All right. So next question here. Will Inline XBRL have any impact on the processing of XBRL US data quality rules for US GAAP and IFRS filers?
Yeah, that's I answered that before. No, the rules still operate fine, and we've been running those rules already on inline filings that have been coming in, so there really is no impact on that. The only possible change will be we'll probably include more rules that look at inline specific type information. So for the only example there is in Inline XBRL, there's some data that may not appear in the filing. That data can be hidden. So the data is not in the, you won't be able to read it in the paper filing, but the data is actually still in there. And there's some need for that, particularly for, things like what's the financial year end date and that kind of information. And so we'll probably be implementing rules just to look at that to make sure that data that shouldn't be hidden isn't being hidden and that kind of stuff. So it will enable us to do probably a little bit more accurate data checking of what's been reported and tie that closer to the actual financial report. Excellent.
And this next question here is for Mike. I think we heard some of the response from Campbell, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is information submitted in Inline XBRL comparable to existing information submitted in the traditional XBRL format? In other words, will Inline XBRL data be relatable to traditional XBRL data?
Yes, as Campbell said, the underlying disclosures are structured in substantially the same way as within the XBRL files. Only the format changes. So as I said earlier, we're embedding the XBRL document into an HTML document. The structured disclosures should not materially change and should be very comparable between XBRL traditional and Inline XBRL going forward.
All right. I'm going to turn to a question from our listeners, and this one goes to Mark. Will the website posting requirement no longer be necessary if a company early adopts the rule once Edgar is ready?
Actually, the website posting requirement elimination and the submission of inline format XBRL are completely independent. And so when the rules go effective, so to speak, which is 30 days after Federal Register publication, which we are aware has not happened yet, but when it does, at that point, the website posting requirement ends. And again, it is separate and apart, independent from the voluntary or required filing in the inline XBRL format.
Thank you, Mark. And now turning back to Mike, can you comment on the differences or improvements the Commission has seen as it relates to XBRL data quality or compliance based on the voluntary inline XBRL program?
Yeah, let me first just say generally, we've observed some data quality improvements that have been relatively significant, and specifically in the data quality targets of the XBRL US Data Quality Committee rule set. We think about 70% of the operating companies appear to be applying these open source, freely available data quality rules. And again, as I said earlier, if you're not currently using those, please take a look at them. We do continue to observe data quality errors in filer creation of inappropriate extensions and inappropriately tagging disclosures with the wrong tag, and also with scaling errors. Just earlier this week, I saw a filing with a discount rate in excess of 400%. So it's clearly a scaling error. I also saw a discount rate that had a number in excess of 28 million. So we're still missing things out there that are clearly errors, and the inline viewer will help us identify those more quickly just by simply using the filters. So the program was designed to introduce the format and also the open source inline viewing code. If you haven't used the inline viewer, I would really encourage you to try it. There's a video of it available on the website that explains how it works and what the data quality features and capabilities. So do think that is going to have an impact on data quality as we move forward, but through the features and capabilities of the viewer, not necessarily just the native format.
All right. And while we're talking about the inline viewer, will the SEC continue to maintain the code for the inline XBRL viewer? What enhancements to review processes does the inline viewer enable for staff and others?
Yeah, we do plan to maintain and even enhance the inline viewer code, and we hope to draw upon some of the enhancements made to the open source code and other enhancements based upon feedback we get from market participants. So please let us know what you think. You can send us an email at structureddata@sec.gov. So just to kind of dig in a little bit on some of the review processes that we see are ineffective, as filers may not be able to readily see the structured data, the viewer will give them the ability to do that. Some of those filters, like with a mouse click, you can see all the negative values in the filing, all the calculations. You can isolate company-specific extensions. You can identify potential scaling errors. You can review any balances that are out of context. You can isolate disclosures by period and thereby have a better understanding as to their status. So there's lots of things and features that will help you zero in on some common data quality topics. We also see, I'll call them non-tagging process steps that can also be positively impact with the inline viewer. And I mentioned them earlier, but let's give you a checklist here. The first one is an automated assessment of disclosure checklist items. So to the extent that you're using the GAAP taxonomy or the IFRS taxonomy, some of the uses of the viewer that we see out there are enabling an automated assessment or checklist of those items, like where's Waldo? Do I have them all? And be able to go through that in a more automated fashion. Clearly not 100%, but if you could automate 60% or 80%, that would be a step in the right direction. I mentioned earlier benchmarking against peers and time series charting. That's something we have up and running inside the Commission. We see it out in the marketplace as well, so that would be a very nice benefit for almost any filer and an investor. Redlining of narrative changes from period to period. That's also something you would expect. And then any reference links to related authoritative content. That could be in the FASB, but we would also anticipate that some of the vendors may make that available to connect between disclosure types and topics to permanent file memos and risk models and other things that will be relevant to the filer preparation and documentation. And all those kinds of activities would be available with a mouse click. Maybe a question, Brian, that the filers might want to consider is, does our service provider or software vendor user interface provide these types of features and capabilities? And if so, great. If not, they may want to consider some sort of adoption of the open source inline viewer.
No, that's a great recommendation. Next question here, and we had a similar one come through on the internet as well. What is the future of the SEC rendering? Will the SEC rendering engine and rendering be discontinued after all filers have implemented inline XBRL? So we're talking about the old traditional XBRL viewer, not the new inline one here.
Yeah, right. So I think just a practical perspective, the SEC rendering engine will not be discontinued after all filers have implemented inline, mainly because investors may want to go back and render or view the XBRL filings between 2009 and the current period. So there's like a practical situation there. You may, in fact, you can see it now. You've noticed that we've continued to include the rendering alongside the inline filings submitted during the inline voluntary program. Whether or not we continue to do that, I don't know, but the rendering application will stay in place if for no other reason to enable viewing of the filings between 2009 and the current period.
All right, and I think that wraps up our questions on the impact on filers and issuers. So now I'll turn it over to Michelle for some CPE questions.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. Okay, we're going to go to some poll questions. And again, for those of you who are getting CPE credit, please make sure that you respond to the questions posed. So the first question we have is, large accelerated filers will be required to comply with the inline XBRL rule, starting with either their first fiscal period on or after June 15th, 2019, their first fiscal period on or after June 15, 2020, or their first fiscal period on or after June 15th, 2021. So we'll give this about another 30 seconds, and please make sure that you record your response. Okay, just about another 10 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to be closing this poll down, and we'll move to our second poll question. Okay, the second poll question is, the first filing submitted by a domestic operating company that is required to be in inline XBRL is a 10Q, 10K, or a Form 10K or 10Q that is the first submission required after the compliance date. So again, please record your response if you're getting CPE credit. And we'll give you about another 30 seconds to respond to this, and then we'll be closing it down. And just by the way, if you did not register for CPE before the session, you can go ahead and respond and then look for instructions to qualify in our follow-up message that we'll be sending out. So if you do want to opt for CPE but didn't do so initially, you can still get it, but just make sure that you respond. Okay, thank you. I'm going to close the poll down. All right, and I'm going to turn it back over to Brian. Let's go on with our questions.
All right, thank you, Michelle. So next we're going to talk about the rule for funds. So these questions are going to go to you, John. If you could tell us, what is the timing of the phase-in for funds?
Thanks, Brian. The timing for the phase-in for funds is a little bit simpler than the phase-in for operating companies. It's really just in two stages. Large fund complexes, defined as those with 1 billion or more in assets under management, have 2 years from the effective date of the rule to switch to inline. The effective date of the rule is 30 days from when it's published in the Federal Register. We expect that to happen soon, as I think someone mentioned earlier. And then there's a 2-year period to comply, so we're looking at about 25 months. Smaller fund complexes, defined as those with less than 1 billion in AUM, actually have 3 years from the effective date of the rule to comply with the switch. And similar to operating companies, the elimination of the website posting requirement goes live immediately upon the effective date of the rule in about 30 days, which is maybe one of the more popular aspects of the rule. It's important to note that we didn't come up with these timeframes out of thin air. We recognize that funds have a lot on their plates, a lot of challenges, and after the proposal was out, we talked to commenters about how much time they would need. Originally, as you may know, we had proposed 1 year for large complexes and 2 years for small complexes. But then we spoke with some of the commenters on the proposal that were most vocal in their opposition. They talked about some of the operational challenges they would face when making the switch to Inline. And in the end, we simply asked folks, how much time would you need? The longest time frame we heard back was 18 months. So we took that. We added some cushion for large complexes, added even more time for smaller complexes, and came out in a place that we think is entirely reasonable. And I think this question dovetails nicely with the next view. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you've already answered the first part of that one. Why you gave funds extra time. I think the second half of that is, what are the unique challenges that funds might have in making the transition?
Right. So as far as why do something different for funds versus operating companies, the simple answer is that IM or investment management rather, was being responsive to its own subset of commenters, fund filers, who expressed different concerns about the transition to Inline than those expressed by operating companies. Those concerns touched on a number of different areas, but really center less on the transition to Inline itself and more on the elimination of the 15-day grace period that funds currently enjoy between the time of a 485 or 497 filing and the subsequent filing of its corresponding standalone XBRL data. That has candidly never been a great process, either for funds, which need to file their registration statement, annual update, or sticker without any XBRL data, then separately generate these standalone XBRL files, then review all of those files against the actual 485 or 497, then make an entirely separate filing. Also never been particularly great for investors who don't get immediate access to structured risk return summary information, or for third-party data aggregators that help deliver that info to investors, who we learned through talking many through the rulemaking process simply can't wait 15 business days in a business environment that expects publicly available data to be delivered to investors almost instantaneously. What these data aggregators are doing in many cases is simply disregarding the SBRL data and employing folks to manually call risk return information from the direct filing, 485 or the supplement. It's important to note that not all data aggregators have these capabilities. So by eliminating the 15 business day delay, we're really sort of democratizing the timely availability of this information and letting smaller aggregators or new market entrants that may not have the capability to employ people to manually call this information. We let those smaller aggregators or new market entrants have access to this info in a matter of, we think will be hours, possibly days, but instead of weeks, no longer a 15 business day delay. All that said, we do recognize that many funds will experience changes in workflows once the 15-day period is eliminated. They've become accustomed to this extra flexibility, and they use that flexibility to either hammer out last-second comments with SEC staff minutes before a filing deadline, or to sync up the mailing of prospectuses and shareholder reports. That's not what the 15-day period was ever intended for, but we do understand that these processes are in place and it's a challenge to change them. Funds also use the 15 days to compare their instance document filings, instance document being the 485 or 497, to the standalone XBRL files generated after the filing. This review can, as you imagine, and as many of you know, be a time-consuming process. But this is where the real advantage of inline XBRL comes in, right? You don't have this separate after-the-fact process of generating XBRL, reviewing it, or sending it to an administrator review. Instead, the entire time, you are working on the core human-readable filing. The XBRL tagging is taking place in the background, meaning the time needed to review these structured data tags is drastically reduced. Funds will still have to build in a bit of time for the review of tags within the document, but nothing even close to the type of review that's conducted today. So you may have to wrap up disagreements with your SEC reviewer slightly earlier, but once you hit submit on that core filing, you're done. No separate process for generating 5 unreadable files per fund, no extra filing to worry about. And so our overall understanding is that inline XBRL, after an initial transition period, can make life easier, simpler, less costly. And I think that's about it for that question.
Thank you, John. All right, so now the next question. Was there any consideration of establishing a voluntary filing program for funds?
And Brian, this is a great question, and the short answer is yes. We gave this a lot of thought. The idea being, if this is also great, why mandate it? Why not just let funds come to the realization on their own that it's beneficial? After a significant amount of discussion, however, we learned that there are several strong reasons why a voluntary approach is not ideal. We felt a voluntary approach would reduce potential benefits to data users, including potential data quality improvements. If not everyone's on board right away, it could reduce the ability to view contextual information about XBRL disclosures. Compared to a mandatory inline XBRL approach, to the extent that inline XBRL use would be more widespread under a mandatory approach than a voluntary one. Our understanding is that it could be a lack of awareness of new technology. It could be inertia. We feel these are common hurdles to market-wide adoption in voluntary regimes. In addition, coordination problems, as well as the existence of network externalities related to the majority of filers using, a particular technology. Here, the more traditional XBRL may lower the rate of voluntary adoption. Because individual filers do not internalize the aggregate benefits of inline XBRL to other filers and data users, from an individual filer standpoint, it may be optimal to delay the one-time adjustment of workflow processes required to transition to inline XBRL until other filers transition to inline XBRL in order to take advantage of potential future gains in inline XBRL preparation experience and reductions in preparation costs due to economies of scale. In other words, you might end up in a situation where everyone's just sort of waiting for everyone else. In addition, under a voluntary alternative, to the extent that some filers use the inline XBRL format while others use the traditional XBRL format, data users would have to maintain indefinitely the capabilities to extract both that traditional XBRL and inline XBRL data. Again, not ideal. And this remains true for some of the suggested alternatives we receive from commenters, such as shortening the 15-day period to 10 days or 7 days. Any delay really negates the benefit of inline for fund filers, which should really end up putting this in the hands of data users hopefully in a matter of mere hours, which, whether you're talking about 15 days, 10 days, 7 days, the huge benefit here is really getting it out to investors or to those that aggregators that provide the information to investors really, really quickly.
Next question here. How should filers handle performance charts? Will the numeric information in charts or plot points be expected to be hidden facts?
Right, and I think these questions are a good opportunity to make a broader point, which was discussed in the context of operating company filers earlier. And that point is that we are not making any substantive changes to the info that is required to be XBRL tagged. It's still the same old risk return summary information for funds. And again, this is a formatting issue. This is moving from XBRL as we know it today to Inline XBRL. But as far as what needs to be tagged, you're still talking about the same risk return summary information, to the extent there are questions about how should this be filed, how should that be filed. I'm sorry, how should this be handled? How should that be handled? Any of those substantive changes, not just these two questions in particular, but anything like that, really the short answer is no change.
All right, and we're getting down to our last couple of questions here. What are the primary benefits of Inline XBRL for funds and users of fund data?
So we discussed the simplified processes for funds earlier, as well as the estimated lower ongoing costs following the transition period. And for users of fund data, the main benefit is really getting this info in a structured format in a matter of hours instead of weeks. Really, in 2018, there's no reason for people to be manually culling risk return summary info and possibly making mistakes. The future in this space, if anything, is really more structured information and faster structured information, not this 15-day delay that was deemed necessary all the way back in 2009. On this last question, I think we've pretty much covered the implications of eliminating the 15-day grace period. So I think we may
we've covered that.
On.
Yep.
Yeah, we may want to move on to CPE.
Thank you very much for that. Before I turn it back over to Michelle here, just kind of the key takeaway from what I've heard. It sounds like, at the risk of oversimplifying this, but while yes, some things have changed, not much has really changed. A lot of your content requirements are all still the same. This really is just a different format for the XBRL files that companies have been submitting for some time now. So I think that's really good news for filers. Still, you want to be working with your vendors and contacting them to make sure if there are any implications to your process that you're getting out ahead of that and addressing that before the rules are official.
Right. I think that's great advice.
So I think we're going to wrap up here with some CPE questions. Michelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, we're going to take a couple additional CPE questions, and I'm going to open up for the first one. Okay, so the first question is, large funds will be required to comply with the rule, and here are the three answers rather. 2 years after the effective date of the rule, 3 years after the effective date of the rule, or is it 4 years after the effective date of the rule? So again, we have about 40 seconds more to go. Please take a look at the responses and post your response so that we can record this. And I think there were a couple of people that were getting CPE that had some polling question issues recording their response. And so just send us an email at info@xbrl.us and we'll take care of you. Okay, great. I'm going to end the polling for that one. I'm going to go to our last poll, which is the 15 business day filing period for the risk return summary for mutual funds will be answer 1, eliminated, answer 2, extended to 20 days, or answer 3, retained. So just record your response, and you've got another 40 seconds or so here. So just another 10 or 15 seconds. And I did want to mention that we did get a lot of questions in. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of those questions. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the SEC does have contact information in release 33-10514. So you can take a look at that and get contact information there for all of our speakers and get some of those questions answered. We do also have some events coming up that you may be interested in, and some of them will respond to some more of these questions, particularly the more technical issues that were raised. But first, let me just end the polling. Thank you for recording your responses. And I want to thank our speakers so much for working with us today and giving a great presentation and providing a lot of really useful information. Thanks to Brian for moderating the program. So to Mike, Mark, and John, and Campbell, thanks very much for your responses. I also want to mention a few existing and upcoming events and programs run by XBRL US that may be of interest. During the session today, the Data Quality Committee rules, validation rules, and guidance were mentioned. The role of the Data Quality Committee is to develop unambiguous guidance on how to tag in XBRL, and they make available automated rules to check for errors. So any issuer can run these rules against their filing for free. So we strongly urge public companies to use the latest set of validation rules from XBRL US and from the Data Quality Committee, use software that has been certified for DQC with the latest rules, and you can also actually influence the rules by participating in our public review. So you can learn more by going to this web address, and we'll send that information to you in a follow-up email. And also, finally, we have some events coming up which may be of interest. We have a second webinar on Inline XBRL, and this is the impact on corporate SEC filers. So this is the second in our series on Inline XBRL. We're going to have a third one coming up after that on data quality. But the next one takes place on September 25th, and we're going to have some great speakers on that to talk to you a little bit more about the impact on SEC filers, and we'll really walk through the differences between conventional XBRL and Inline XBRL. And finally, we have an investor forum coming up on Investor Forum 2018 on powering fintech. And this is going to take place in New York City on November 8th. This is a free event, it's a half-day program, and we urge interested organizations and individuals to attend. And you can see the URL there. So with that, I want to thank our audience for joining us today, and thanks again to our speakers. And we hope to see you on our next webinar on September 25th. Thank you.